A muggy afternoon, long shadows, dust suspended over the station. A German shepherd comes down the slope and crosses the tracks to the emptiest space. On bench 3C, a lady in a dark coat keeps her gaze on the platform. The dog stops in the center, drops an earth-soaked bundle, and retreats without a sound. The train screeches, the whistle ceases, the wind passes between vibrating metal plates. Passengers hesitate, the engineer engages the gear. The train drags itself away. From the torn fabric falls an old tiny shoe. Inside, a round pendant with 2 letters, R.C. The lady's hand stops a centimeter from the engraved metal, and for a second, everything stopped. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for joining us. Now we return to our story. The afternoon heat hung heavy over Millbrook Station as Margaret Henderson adjusted her worn leather purse and checked her watch for the 3rd time. The 4:15 train to Cincinnati was running on schedule, just as it had every Thursday for the past 43 years. Around her, the same familiar faces gathered on the weathered platform, their conversations a gentle murmur against the backdrop of cicadas singing in the nearby oak trees. Margaret settled onto bench 3C in the front car, her usual spot by the window. At 78, she had earned her routines. The weekly trip to visit her sister in the city had become her lifeline to the world beyond Millbrook's sleepy streets. This small Ohio town, nestled between rolling hills and forgotten by progress, moved at the pace of its elderly residents. The younger generation had long since departed for opportunities in Columbus or Cleveland, leaving behind those too rooted or too weary to start over. The train whistle's melancholy call echoed across the valley as engineer Bob Mitchell prepared for departure. He had been making this run for 26 years, and he knew every curve, every crossing, every soul who boarded his train. Today felt no different from any other sweltering Thursday in late August, until he spotted movement on the tracks ahead. A German shepherd emerged from the tree line beyond the platform, its golden coat dulled by dust and dried earth. The dog moved with purpose, something clenched firmly in its jaws. Passengers began pointing through the windows as the animal approached the slow-moving train with unwavering determination. Bob yanked the brake lever as the dog stepped directly onto the tracks. Metal screeched against metal, and the train lurched to a halt. Passengers stumbled forward in their seats, confused voices rising in the sudden chaos. Through it all, the German shepherd remained motionless in the center of the platform, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. Margaret pressed her face to the window, her heart racing from the unexpected stop. The dog dropped its burden with deliberate care, then lifted its head to scan the crowd gathering on the platform. What it had carried became visible in the afternoon sunlight. A tiny baby shoe, weathered and darkened with age, still damp with soil. The conductor, James Riley, was the first to approach the mysterious object. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he knelt beside the small shoe, noting immediately the delicate silver pendant that had spilled from within. The round charm bore 2 initials engraved in elegant script, R.C. A collective gasp arose from the passengers who had disembarked to investigate. Margaret felt her legs weaken as recognition dawned like a terrible sunrise. She gripped the train car's handrail, her knuckles white against the metal, as memories she had spent decades burying clawed their way to the surface. "Rose Catherine," she whispered, the name barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. Her granddaughter had been just 3 months old when she disappeared. Margaret could still remember the weight of that tiny body in her arms, the sweet scent of baby powder, the way Rose's fingers would curl around her grandmother's thumb. The funeral had been closed, casket, they said, because of the condition of the remains found by the river. But Margaret had never truly believed it. A grandmother knows. She had insisted to anyone who would listen. A grandmother always knows. The pendant in her trembling palm was identical to the one Margaret herself had fastened around Rose Catherine's neck on the day she was born. She had saved for months to buy that silver charm, having it engraved with the initials that honored both her own mother, Rose, and her daughter, Catherine. It was meant to be a family heirloom, passed down through generations of Henderson women. Dr. Patricia Lawson, Millbrook's only physician and the closest thing the town had to an authority figure, pushed through the crowd. She examined the shoe with professional detachment, though even she couldn't hide her bewilderment at the bizarre circumstances. "This appears to have been recently disturbed from burial," she announced, noting the specific type of soil clinging to the leather. "Someone should contact the sheriff's office." But by the time anyone thought to look for the German Shepherd again, it had vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The platform erupted in speculation and nervous chatter. Some passengers reboarded immediately, eager to distance themselves from the unsettling discovery. Others lingered, drawn by morbid curiosity and the promise of gossip that would sustain their conversations for weeks to come. Margaret remained frozen on the platform, clutching the pendant as tears she hadn't shed in years began to fall. Rose Catherine's disappearance had destroyed her family. Her daughter Catherine had never recovered from the loss, dying of a broken heart just 2 years later. Margaret's son-in-law had moved away with barely a goodbye, unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of Millbrook. The official investigation had been brief and conclusive. A tragic accident. They said the baby had been swept away during the spring floods of 1980. The body found downstream was too damaged for proper identification, but the clothing matched what Catherine remembered dressing her daughter in that morning. The case was closed within a month, filed away with other small-town tragedies that were easier to forget than to question. But Margaret had never stopped questioning. She had spent years walking the riverbank, searching for clues that more thorough investigators might have missed. She had pestered Sheriff Coleman until he finally told her, not unkindly, that she needed to let her granddaughter rest in peace. The town had collectively decided that Margaret's grief had made her irrational, and eventually she had learned to keep her doubts to herself. Now, holding this impossible piece of evidence, Margaret felt vindicated and terrified in equal measure. If Rose Catherine's shoe had been buried somewhere other than the cemetery, then what had they put in that tiny coffin all those years ago? And more importantly, where was her granddaughter now? The train finally resumed its journey, but Margaret couldn't bring herself to board. She stood alone on the platform as the cars disappeared around the bend, the pendant warm in her palm and questions multiplying in her mind like summer storms gathering on the horizon. Mayor Linda Thornton arrived within the hour, alerted by concerned citizens who worried that word of the mysterious discovery might reach the wrong ears. Millbrook survived on its reputation as a peaceful, unremarkable place where nothing interesting ever happened. The last thing they needed was attention from outsiders looking for sensational stories about unexplained mysteries. "Now, Margaret," Linda said in her practiced political voice, "I know this must be upsetting, but we can't jump to conclusions. Could be someone's idea of a cruel joke, or maybe just a coincidence. You know how people are always digging up old things when they're gardening." But Margaret wasn't listening to the mayor's reasonable explanations. She was remembering other things that had seemed unimportant at the time. The way certain people had avoided her eyes in the weeks after Rose Catherine's disappearance. The hushed conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The sealed records at the courthouse that she had never been allowed to see. As the sun began to set behind the hills surrounding Millbrook, Margaret walked slowly toward Main Street, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never dared to consider. The German Shepherd's appearance felt less like coincidence and more like destiny, as if some force beyond understanding had decided it was finally time for the truth to surface. In her small house on Elm Street, Margaret carefully placed the pendant in her jewelry box next to a faded photograph of Rose Catherine. Tomorrow, she decided, she would start asking questions again, but this time she wouldn't be satisfied with the convenient answers that had silenced her 40 years ago. The dog had brought her a message, and Margaret Henderson intended to follow wherever it might lead. 3 days after the incident at the station, Millbrook buzzed with speculation and whispered theories. The story had spread through the town like wildfire, each retelling adding new details and embellishments. Some folks claimed the German Shepherd had glowing eyes. Others swore they had seen it wandering the cemetery at midnight. Margaret Henderson found herself at the center of attention she neither wanted nor welcomed. Sarah Mitchell had returned to Millbrook reluctantly, drawn back by news that her mother, Agnes, had suffered a mild stroke. As a retired investigative journalist who had spent 30 years covering stories for the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Sarah possessed a natural skepticism towards small-town mysteries. She had planned to stay just long enough to arrange proper care for her mother, then return to her quiet retirement in Sandusky. But the story of the mysterious dog and the baby shoe intrigued her professional instincts. Sarah had built her career on the principle that coincidences were usually anything but coincidental. When she heard that Margaret Henderson, whom she remembered as a sharp and sensible woman, was being dismissed as an elderly person whose grief had finally gotten the better of her, Sarah's investigative radar began to ping. "There's something people aren't saying," Agnes Mitchell told her daughter from her hospital bed. Despite the stroke affecting her speech, the 82-year-old's mind remained sharp. Back then, when that baby went missing, folks talked in whispers. Always felt like there was more to the story than what made it into Sheriff Coleman's report. Sarah had covered enough stories involving missing children to know that small towns often harbored dark secrets beneath their peaceful facades. The Henderson case from 1980 had all the hallmarks of an investigation that had been wrapped up too quickly, too neatly. A 3-month-old baby doesn't simply disappear during a flood without leaving more questions than answers. On Saturday morning, Sarah found herself walking the streets of her childhood, noting how little had changed in the decades since she had left for college. The same hardware store, the same diner, even the same elderly men playing checkers outside the barber shop. It was a town frozen in time, which made the German Shepherd's dramatic appearance all the more significant. She discovered Margaret Henderson sitting on a bench in Millbrook's small downtown park, staring at the fountain that had been dedicated to the town's founders in 1923. The older woman looked frail and tired, but her eyes held a determination that Sarah recognized from her own reflection during the most challenging investigations of her career. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Sarah Mitchell, Agnes Mitchell's daughter. I was wondering if I might ask you a few questions about what happened at the station." Margaret looked up with surprise. She had expected another visit from Mayor Thornton, or one of the well-meaning church ladies who wanted to convince her that she was imagining things. A journalist, even a retired one, was something different entirely. "You believe me?" Margaret said. "It wasn't a question. I believe that something significant happened," Sarah replied carefully. "I'd like to understand what that might be." For the first time in 40 years, Margaret found herself talking to someone who listened without judgment or dismissal. She told Sarah about the pendant, about the doubts she had harbored since 1980, about the feeling that important people in town had wanted the investigation closed quickly. Sarah took notes in her shorthand, a skill that had served her well during decades of interviews. "Tell me about the day Rose Catherine disappeared," Sarah said gently. Margaret's voice grew steady as she recounted details that remained vivid despite the passing years. Catherine had been visiting for the weekend with the baby. It had been an ordinary Saturday morning. Catherine had gone to the grocery store while Margaret watched Rose Catherine. When Catherine returned, she found the front door open and the baby missing from her crib. The sheriff said she must have crawled out and somehow made it to the river. Margaret continued. But Rose Catherine was only 3 months old. She couldn't even roll over yet, let alone crawl, and my front door has a heavy spring. It doesn't stay open by itself. Sarah made note of these details, already seeing the holes in the official story. A 3-month-old baby doesn't crawl anywhere, much less half a mile to a riverbank. Someone had taken Rose Catherine from that house, and for reasons Sarah intended to discover, the truth had been buried along with an empty coffin. As they spoke, a commotion near the edge of town caught their attention. Several residents had gathered on Maple Street, pointing and talking excitedly. The German Shepherd had returned, and this time it wasn't alone. A small crowd followed at a respectful distance as the dog led them toward the outskirts of Millbrook, where houses became sparse and the hills began in earnest. Sarah and Margaret joined the procession. Though Sarah noticed that several prominent townspeople were conspicuously absent, Mayor Thornton was nowhere to be seen, nor was William Garrett, the retired elementary school principal who still served on various town committees. Dr. Lawson had also made herself scarce since the incident at the station. The dog stopped at a house that had been abandoned for as long as most people could remember. The 2-story Victorian sat on 3 acres of overgrown land, its paint long since faded and its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Hydrangeas had grown wild around the foundation, creating a blue and purple wilderness that nearly obscured the first-floor windows. "That's the old Whitmore place," volunteered Tom Bradley, a local handyman who had followed the crowd. "Old Joe Whitmore used to be the groundskeeper at the school. Kept to himself mostly, did odd jobs around town. One day he just up and vanished. Must have been 15, maybe 20 years ago now." Sarah filed this information away as the German Shepherd began digging frantically near what had once been a flower garden. The crowd watched in fascination as the dog's powerful paws sent dirt flying. Within minutes, it had uncovered something that made several onlookers gasp. A wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, emerged from the earth. The wood had been preserved by the dry soil and careful wrapping in what appeared to be multiple layers of plastic. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to protect whatever was inside from moisture and decay. Dr. Lawson appeared as if from nowhere, asserting her authority to examine the find before anyone else could touch it. But Sarah noticed that the physician's hands shook slightly as she carefully opened the container, and her face went pale when she saw the contents. Inside were baby clothes, tiny garments that had been preserved with the same care as the box itself, a pink dress with pearl buttons, impossibly small socks, a bonnet with delicate lace trim. Underneath the clothes lay a composition notebook, its pages yellowed but still legible. "This should go to the sheriff," Dr. Lawson announced, but Tom Bradley was faster. He had already glimpsed the first page of the notebook and was reading aloud before anyone could stop him. "Day 1, I had to take her. They said it was the only way to protect the family from scandal, but this doesn't feel right. The baby is innocent in all this. Why should she pay for the mistakes of others?" A murmur ran through the crowd as the implications began to sink in. Someone had taken Rose Catherine Henderson, not accidentally during a flood, but deliberately, and someone else had known about it, had been forced to participate against their better judgment. Dr. Lawson snatched the notebook from Tom's hands, but not before he had read enough to confirm everyone's growing suspicions. The German Shepherd sat back on its haunches, tongue lolling out as if satisfied with the morning's work. Then, just as it had at the station, the dog simply walked away, disappearing into the trees before anyone thought to follow. Margaret sank onto the steps of the abandoned house, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she had suspected for 40 years. Her granddaughter had been taken, hidden somewhere, possibly even raised by someone else. But why? And who in Millbrook had possessed enough influence to cover up such a crime and make it stick for 4 decades? Sarah's reporter instincts were in full swing now. She had covered enough stories to recognize a conspiracy when she saw one, and this had all the hallmarks of powerful people protecting their own interests at the expense of truth and justice. The question was whether anyone involved was still alive, still in town, and still trying to keep their secrets buried. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said quietly, "I think it's time we started digging into some old records, the kind that might not be easy to find." Margaret nodded, still clutching the silver pendant that had started this unlikely investigation. For the first time in 40 years, she felt hope stirring in her chest. The German Shepherd had brought them more than just physical evidence. It had brought them proof that Rose Catherine's story wasn't over. As the crowd dispersed and Dr. Lawson hurried away with the notebook, Sarah made mental notes of who had seemed surprised by the discovery and who had seemed worried. In her experience, the guilty parties were often the ones who disappeared the moment things got interesting. The sun was setting behind the hills again, painting the abandoned house in shades of gold and orange. But for Sarah Mitchell and Margaret Henderson, the day was just beginning. They had a mystery to solve and 40 years of lies to unravel. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a corner building that had once been the town's most prosperous bank. Sarah Mitchell spent Monday morning in its basement archives, surrounded by dusty boxes and the musty smell of old paper. The librarian, a nervous woman named Ellen Foster, had reluctantly granted access to the historical records after Sarah mentioned her credentials as a retired journalist. "Most folks don't have much interest in the old files," Ellen had said, wringing her hands, "especially not from that particular time period." Sarah found the comment intriguing. In her experience, librarians were usually enthusiastic about anyone showing interest in historical research. Ellen's discomfort suggested that certain records had been accessed before, possibly by people who preferred that others not follow in their footsteps. The first box contained newspaper clippings from the Millbrook Herald, the weekly publication that had ceased operating in 1995. Sarah methodically worked through issues from 1980, finding surprisingly little coverage of Rose Catherine Henderson's disappearance. The initial story had been brief and clinical. Local infant missing after flooding. The follow-up articles were even shorter, and by the third week, the story had disappeared entirely from the paper's pages. More interesting were the stories that had received prominent coverage during the same period. The elementary school had broken ground on a new wing that spring, funded by a generous anonymous donation. Principal William Garrett had been quoted extensively about the expansion's importance for Millbrook's future. The town council had also approved several new development projects, all sponsored by a newly formed organization called the Millbrook Community Foundation. Sarah had covered enough municipal politics to recognize the pattern. Money had been flowing through Millbrook in 1980, and the people controlling that money had possessed the influence to shape local news coverage. The Henderson family's tragedy had been deliberately minimized while other stories received disproportionate attention. In the third box, Sarah discovered something that made her pulse quicken. A manila folder labeled Fire Department Reports, 1980, contained a detailed account of the blaze that had destroyed part of the county courthouse in August of that year. The fire had been ruled accidental, caused by faulty electrical wiring in the building's aging basement. However, the list of destroyed documents read like a deliberate targeting of sensitive records. Birth certificates from 1979-1980, adoption records spanning 3 years, property transfer documents, and most significantly, several files from the Department of Children and Family Services that had been temporarily stored in the courthouse basement during an office renovation. Sarah photographed the fire report with her phone, noting that the incident had occurred just 2 months after Rose Catherine's disappearance. The timing felt too convenient to be coincidental. especially when she discovered that the building's electrical system had been inspected and certified safe just 6 months before the fire. Her investigation was interrupted by Ellen Foster, who appeared in the doorway looking even more anxious than before. "I'm sorry, Miss Mitchell, but I need to close the archives early today. We're having some electrical work done, and it's not safe to have visitors in the basement." Sarah glanced around the basement, noting the absence of any electricians or equipment that would suggest imminent repair work. Ellen's lie was transparent, but arguing would only draw unwanted attention. She gathered her notes and headed upstairs, filing away the librarian's sudden nervousness as another piece of the growing puzzle. Outside the library, Sarah was surprised to find Margaret Henderson waiting by the fountain with a stranger. The unknown woman appeared to be in her early 40s, with dark hair and intense green eyes that seemed familiar despite Sarah's certainty that they had never met. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Walsh," Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion. She drove up from Cincinnati after hearing about what happened at the station. Rebecca Walsh extended her hand with a nervousness that mirrored Ellen Foster's. "I hope you don't mind my coming here unannounced. When I heard the story on the news, I felt like I had to make the trip. There are some things about my own past that might be connected to what you've discovered." They found a quiet table at Miller's Diner, where Rebecca began to tell a story that sent chills down Sarah's spine. She had been adopted as an infant by the Walsh family in 1980, under circumstances that had always troubled her adoptive parents. The adoption had been arranged privately, outside normal channels, by a lawyer who had since disappeared from Ohio entirely. "My adoptive mother, God rest her soul, always felt something wasn't right about how quickly everything was processed," Rebecca explained. "She said the lawyer was in a terrible hurry, like he wanted to get the paperwork finished before anyone could ask too many questions. And there were no medical records, no information about my birth parents. Everything was sealed." Sarah leaned forward. "Oh, do you remember the lawyer's name?" "Charles Morrison. Mom kept all the papers, thinking I might want to see them someday. But when I tried to contact his office a few years ago, I found out it had been closed since 1981. The State Bar Association had no forwarding address." Margaret had remained silent during Rebecca's account, but now she reached into her purse and withdrew the silver pendant found in Rose Catherine's shoe. Rebecca's face went white as she recognized the jewelry. "I have one just like it," Rebecca whispered, fumbling with the clasp of a chain around her neck. She pulled out an identical pendant, the same size and style, with the same intricate engraving around the edges. The only difference was the initials, where Rose Catherine's bore R.C. Rebecca's read R.W. The three women stared at the matching pendants in stunned silence. The coincidence was too extraordinary to dismiss, yet too fantastic to fully accept. Sarah's journalistic instincts told her that she was looking at evidence of something far more complex than a simple kidnapping. "Where did you get yours?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was the only thing that came with me when I was adopted. Mom said the lawyer told her it was a family heirloom that my birth mother wanted me to have." Sarah studied the pendants more closely, noting details that had escaped her initial examination. Both were crafted from the same quality silver, with identical engravings around the perimeter, but more significantly, both showed signs of having been created as part of a set. The craftsmanship suggested a local jeweler rather than mass production. "Mrs. Henderson, where did you have Rose Catherine's pendant made?" "Goldman's Jewelry, right here on Main Street. Mr. Goldman made it special for me, said he could engrave anything I wanted, but he passed away years ago and his shop closed down." Sarah made a mental note to investigate whether any records from Goldman's Jewelry might have survived. If Rebecca's pendant had been created by the same craftsman, it would suggest that whoever arranged her adoption had been intimately familiar with Rose Catherine's case. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William Garrett, the retired elementary school principal. The elderly man approached their table with the careful gait of someone who had heard about their discussion and wanted to insert himself into it. "Ladies, I couldn't help but notice that you're investigating some rather ancient history," he said. His tone friendly, but his eyes guarded. "I hope you're being careful not to stir up painful memories for folks who've spent years trying to heal from old tragedies." Sarah recognized the veiled warning immediately. In 40 years of journalism, she had encountered countless officials who preferred that certain stories remain buried. William Garrett's concern seemed less about protecting feelings and more about protecting secrets. "We're just trying to understand what really happened to Rose Catherine Henderson," Sarah replied evenly. "Surely there's nothing wrong with seeking the truth." "Of course not," Garrett agreed, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I just want to make sure you ladies understand that Millbrook is a small town. People talk, and sometimes they say things that aren't entirely accurate, especially about events from so long ago." After he left, Rebecca leaned across the table. "That man makes me nervous. There's something about him that feels familiar, but not in a good way." Margaret nodded grimly. "William's always been involved in everything that happens in this town. He was the elementary school principal when Rose Catherine disappeared, and he's been on every important committee since then. If there was a cover-up, he would have known about it." Sarah was beginning to see the outline of a conspiracy that went deeper than a simple kidnapping. The fire at the courthouse, the hasty adoption arranged by a disappearing lawyer, the matching pendants, and now a prominent town official who seemed unusually concerned about their investigation. Too many coincidences pointed to a coordinated effort to hide the truth about Rose Catherine Henderson. As they prepared to leave the diner, Rebecca made a decision that surprised them all. "I'm going to stay in town for a few days. I've taken vacation time from work, and I want to help you figure this out. If there's even a chance that I'm Rose Catherine, then I need to know the truth." Margaret clasped Rebecca's hand, tears forming in her eyes. "You have her eyes," she said softly. "I noticed it the moment I saw you. You have Rose Catherine's eyes." The sun was setting again as they walked back toward Main Street, three women bound together by questions that demanded answers. Sarah felt the familiar excitement that came with a breaking story, but also the weight of responsibility that accompanied an investigation with such personal stakes. Somewhere in Millbrook's carefully maintained facade of small-town tranquility lay the truth about what had happened to Rose Catherine Henderson. And Sarah was beginning to suspect that the truth involved some of the town's most respected citizens in ways that would shake the community to its foundations. Rebecca Walsh found herself unable to sleep in the small room she had rented above Miller's Diner. Every time she closed her eyes, fragments of memories that might not even be real danced behind her eyelids. A woman's voice singing lullabies, the smell of lavender and old wood. The feeling of being carried in strong arms through rooms filled with afternoon sunlight. Her adoptive parents had been loving and supportive, but they had always been honest about the unusual circumstances of her adoption. Growing up, Rebecca had created elaborate fantasies about her birth family, imagining scenarios that ranged from tragic to romantic. She had never allowed herself to hope that she might actually find answers to questions that had haunted her since childhood. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected development. Tom Bradley, the handyman who had helped uncover the box at the Whitmore house, appeared at Margaret's front door with news that sent the three women rushing back to the train station. "Thought you ladies would want to know," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "I was doing some repair work on the old ticket office yesterday, and I found something hidden under the floorboards. Looks like it's been there for years." The Millbrook Station ticket office had been closed since 1995, when passenger service was reduced to the single daily run that still operated. The building had fallen into disrepair, its windows boarded up and its interior left to collect dust and memories. Tom had been hired by the railroad company to assess whether the structure was worth preserving or should be demolished. I was checking for termite damage when I noticed some loose boards, he explained, as he led them into the musty building. When I pried them up, I found this wrapped in oilcloth. He produced a manila envelope, yellowed with age, but still intact. Inside were 3 handwritten letters, each addressed to Catherine Henderson in the same careful script. The return address was simply a friend, but the postmarks showed they had been mailed from Millbrook between June and August of 1980. Sarah carefully unfolded the first letter, noting that the paper was expensive stationery rather than ordinary writing paper. Someone had taken considerable care with these communications, yet they had never reached their intended recipient. "My dear Catherine," the first letter began, "I'm writing to warn you that people you trust are not what they seem. There are plans being made regarding your daughter that you must know about. Meet me at the Old Miller's Pond on Saturday evening if you want to understand what really happened to Rose Catherine." The second letter was more urgent. "Catherine, I saw you at the grocery store yesterday, but I couldn't approach you with so many people around. They're watching you, waiting for you to accept their story and stop asking questions. The baby is safe, but she's not where they told you she is. Please, you must trust me." The third letter was the most specific. "I can't remain silent any longer. They forced me to help them, said it was the only way to protect everyone involved, but this is wrong, and I'm going to make it right. I have proof that Rose Catherine is alive and well. Meet me at the station tomorrow night, and I'll show you everything." Margaret sank onto one of the dusty benches, overwhelmed by the implications. Someone had tried to contact Catherine about Rose Catherine's whereabouts, but the letters had been intercepted before they could be delivered. Her daughter had never known that someone was trying to help her find the truth. "The handwriting," Rebecca said suddenly. "It looks familiar." Sarah examined the letters more closely, comparing the script to samples she had found in the library archives. The careful formation of letters and the distinctive way the writer crossed his T's matched documents she had seen signed by Joe Whitmore, the groundskeeper who had disappeared from the abandoned house where they had found the baby clothes. Joe Whitmore was trying to tell Catherine what really happened, Sarah concluded. But someone intercepted his letters and made sure she never got them. The implications were staggering. Not only had Rose Catherine been taken deliberately, but someone had worked actively to prevent her mother from learning the truth. The interception of mail suggested access to the postal system or influence over postal workers. In a town the size of Millbrook, that pointed to someone with considerable authority. Tom Bradley scratched his head thoughtfully. "Do you know, I remember Joe Whitmore, quiet fellow, but he seemed troubled about something during his last months in town. He kept asking people odd questions about who they trusted, like he was trying to figure out who was safe to talk to." "What kind of questions?" Sarah asked. "Well, he asked me once if I thought Sheriff Coleman was an honest man, and he wanted to know how long Dr. Lawson had been practicing in town. Whether she had any connections to the state adoption agencies. Seemed like he was investigating something, but he wouldn't say what." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. The timeline was beginning to make sense in a way that terrified her. If Joe Whitmore had been trying to expose the truth in 1980, and if he had been forced to disappear before he could do so, then the people responsible for Rose Catherine's disappearance were still in Millbrook. Still protecting their secret, their discovery attracted attention within hours. Dr. Patricia Lawson appeared at the station as they were examining the letters, her face flushed with what might have been exertion or anxiety. "I heard you found something else," she said, slightly out of breath. "The town council is concerned that all this digging around is going to attract unwanted attention from outside investigators. Millbrook doesn't need that kind of scrutiny." Sarah noticed that Dr. Lawson's concern seemed focused more on protecting the town's reputation than on discovering the truth about a missing child. In her experience, Innocent people worried about justice. Guilty people worried about exposure. Dr. Lawson, Sarah said carefully, you've been practicing in Millbrook for a long time. Do you remember anything unusual about the adoption procedures in 1980? Any cases that were processed unusually quickly? The physician's eyes darted away from Sarah's direct gaze. I don't recall anything specific. Medical records from that period are confidential anyway, even after all these years. But Rebecca had been studying the doctor's face, and she saw something that made her heart race. There was recognition there, quickly suppressed but unmistakable. Dr. Lawson knew more than she was admitting, and her discomfort suggested that her knowledge was not something she was proud of. After the doctor left, Rebecca shared her observation with Margaret and Sarah. She recognized me, Rebecca said with certainty. When she first looked at me, before she could control her expression, there was definitely recognition. Margaret squeezed Rebecca's hand. That might mean she was involved in your adoption. If you really are Rose Catherine, she would have been the one to examine you before you were placed with the Walsh family. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that none of them wanted to believe but couldn't ignore. A network of respected community members had conspired to take Rose Catherine Henderson from her family, arrange her adoption through illegal channels, and then cover up their actions by destroying evidence and silencing anyone who threatened to expose them. That evening, as they sat in Margaret's living room going through old photographs and documents, Rebecca made a connection that sent shockwaves through their investigation. Look at this, she said, pointing to a picture from the 1980 Millbrook Elementary School yearbook that Margaret had kept. That's William Garrett, but look who's standing next to him. In the photograph, Principal Garrett stood beside a much younger Dr. Lawson, who was identified in the caption as the school's volunteer medical advisor. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was a man Rebecca now recognized as Charles Morrison, the lawyer who had arranged her adoption. They all knew each other, Sarah breathed. They were working together even before Rose Catherine disappeared. The conspiracy was bigger than they had imagined, involving not just individuals but institutions, the school, the medical community, the legal system, and probably the sheriff's department had all been compromised. Rose Catherine Henderson hadn't just been kidnapped. She had been systematically erased from her family's life by people who possessed the authority and influence to make their deception stick for 40 years. As if summoned by their discovery, the German Shepherd appeared again outside Margaret's window. This time, instead of leading them somewhere new, the dog simply sat in the front yard, looking directly at the house as if it were standing guard. Rebecca found herself drawn to the window, studying the animal's intelligent eyes. I feel like he's trying to protect us, she said softly. Like he knows that we're getting close to something dangerous. Margaret joined her at the window. Maybe he is. In all my years, I've never seen a dog behave the way this one does. It's almost like he's got a mission to complete. Sarah was more practical in her assessment, but even she couldn't deny that the German Shepherd's timing was remarkably convenient. Every time they needed evidence or encouragement to continue their investigation, the dog appeared with exactly what was required. Whatever his motivation, Sarah said, he's given us enough evidence to prove that Rose Catherine didn't die in that flood. The question now is whether we can prove what really happened to her without putting ourselves in danger. The three women sat in contemplative silence as night fell over Millbrook. Outside, the German Shepherd remained at his post, a silent sentinel watching over the only people in town who seemed willing to seek the truth about a 40-year-old lie. Tomorrow, Sarah decided, they would have to confront the people who had been working so hard to keep their secret buried. The time for subtle investigation was over. The truth was finally within reach, but getting to it would require courage that none of them were sure they possessed. Thursday morning brought an unexpected ally to their investigation. Ellen Foster appeared at Margaret's front door at dawn, her face pale but determined. The nervous librarian carried a cardboard box that she handled as if it contained explosives. "I couldn't sleep all night," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been keeping these hidden for 20 years, ever since I started working at the library. My predecessor, Mrs. Henley, made me promise to keep them locked away, but after seeing what you've discovered, I think the truth is more important than old promises." Inside the box were documents that Mrs. Henley had rescued from the courthouse fire in 1980. She had been working late that night, helping to transfer files during the office renovation, when the blaze started. Instead of fleeing immediately, she had grabbed an armload of records from the basement, including several files that someone had clearly marked for destruction. Sarah's hands shook as she examined birth certificates that had been altered, adoption records with missing pages, and most damning of all, a carbon copy of a letter from Charles Morrison to William Garrett outlining the placement procedure for what they euphemistically called the Henderson situation. The subject infant has been successfully transferred to pre-approved family in Cincinnati. Sarah read aloud, "All documentation has been prepared according to your specifications. Recommend immediate disposal of remaining evidence and coordination with medical personnel to ensure consistent narrative." The letter was dated 3 days after Rose Catherine's supposed drowning, confirming that she had been alive and well when the funeral took place. Someone else had been buried in that tiny coffin, or perhaps it had been empty all along. Rebecca sat in stunned silence as the implications sank in. She wasn't just possibly Rose Catherine Henderson. The documentation proved beyond doubt that she was the baby who had been stolen from Margaret's house 40 years ago. The Walsh family had unknowingly participated in the cover-up of a kidnapping, while Catherine Henderson had buried an empty casket and grieved for a daughter who was very much alive. "There's more," Ellen said, producing a manila folder marked Confidential W.G. Inside were photographs and documents that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning decades. William Garrett hadn't just been involved in Rose Catherine's case. He had been coordinating a network that placed unwanted children with families willing to pay substantial fees, all while maintaining the fiction that the children had died in accidents or illnesses. Margaret found herself reliving the morning of Rose Catherine's disappearance with new understanding. She remembered William Garrett arriving at the house shortly after the sheriff, ostensibly to offer support and comfort. In reality, he had been there to ensure that the official story would be accepted without question. "He convinced me that I was too distraught to think clearly," Margaret said, tears flowing freely. "He kept saying that grief could make people imagine things that weren't real. I believed him because he was the school principal, because everyone respected him." Sarah studied the documents with growing anger. This wasn't just a single crime. It was evidence of a conspiracy that had stolen children from their families for financial gain. The fire at the courthouse hadn't been accidental. It had been arson designed to destroy evidence of multiple illegal adoptions. "We need to confront them," Sarah declared. "All of them. Dr. Lawson, William Garrett, anyone else who was involved. They're counting on our fear to keep their secrets safe." Rebecca felt a strange sense of completion rather than anger. After 40 years of wondering about her origins, she finally had answers. The sadness of learning about the conspiracy was offset by the joy of discovering that Margaret Henderson was truly her grandmother, that she belonged to a family that had never stopped loving her. They decided to start with Dr. Lawson, reasoning that she might be more willing to cooperate if approached away from the other conspirators. They found her at the medical clinic, a small building that had served Millbrook's healthcare needs since the 1970s. Dr. Lawson's face went white when she saw the documents Ellen had provided. For a moment, she seemed to age 10 years before their eyes. Then, to their surprise, she began to cry. "I've regretted my involvement in this for 40 years, she said, sinking into her office chair. "But once you're part of something like this, there's no way out. They made sure of that." She explained that the conspiracy had begun with good intentions. At least in William Garrett's presentation, there were children in difficult situations, families that couldn't care for them properly, and other families desperate to adopt. The official channels were slow and bureaucratic, he had argued. Why not streamline the process and help everyone involved? At first, it seemed legitimate, Dr. Lawson continued. The children really were better off with their new families. But then William started targeting children from families he considered unfit, and the definition of unfit kept expanding. Rose Catherine had been taken because Catherine Henderson was a single mother struggling financially. In William Garrett's worldview, she didn't deserve to raise a child when wealthy families like the Walshes were desperate to adopt. The flood had provided a convenient cover story, and the network had experience making children disappear without arousing suspicion. Joe Whitmore was supposed to deliver Rose Catherine to a meeting point outside town, Dr. Lawson revealed. But he got attached to the baby during the week he was hiding her. He started asking questions about whether what we were doing was really in her best interest. When Joe threatened to expose the operation, he had been given a choice: disappear voluntarily or face charges for kidnapping that William Garrett could easily arrange through his connections in law enforcement. Joe had chosen exile, but not before trying to contact Catherine Henderson with the truth. "Where is he now?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. He was supposed to leave Ohio and never come back. I always hoped he found peace somewhere, because he was the only one among us who maintained his conscience." Rebecca listened to Dr. Lawson's confession with mixed emotions. Part of her was grateful to finally understand her story, but another part was horrified by the casual way these people had stolen her life and traumatized her birth family. The Walshes had been good parents, but they had unknowingly built their family on a foundation of lies and theft. "What about the other children?" Sarah pressed. "How many families were destroyed by this operation?" Dr. Lawson's estimate was staggering. Over the course of 15 years, the network had arranged the illegal placement of more than 30 children. Some had been taken from families deemed unworthy, others from mothers who had been pressured to give up their babies. The courthouse fire had destroyed most of the evidence, but Dr. Lawson had kept her own records, hidden in a safety deposit box in case she ever needed protection from her co-conspirators. "I'll testify," she said suddenly. "I'll tell authorities everything I know. I'm 73 years old, and I'm tired of carrying this guilt. William Garrett has been threatening me for years, saying that if I ever talked, he'd make sure I was charged as a co-conspirator. But I don't care anymore." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William Garrett himself, accompanied by two men Rebecca didn't recognize. The former principal's friendly facade had been replaced by something much darker and more desperate. "Dr. Lawson, I thought we had an understanding about keeping certain matters private," he said, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. Sarah stepped protectively in front of Rebecca and Margaret. "Mr. Garrett, I think it's time for you to answer some questions about your role in the disappearance of Rose Catherine Henderson. I don't know what lies Patricia has been telling you," he replied smoothly, "but you should be careful about making accusations against respected members of the community, particularly accusations based on the fantasies of grief-stricken elderly women and strangers looking for attention." But his confidence seemed forced, and Sarah could see fear in his eyes. The presence of the two men suggested that William Garrett was prepared to use intimidation to protect his secrets, but it also confirmed that he was guilty of everything they suspected. Rebecca found her voice for the first time since entering the clinic. "I'm not a stranger looking for attention. I'm Rose Catherine Henderson, and I know what you did to my family." The color drained from William Garrett's face as he looked closely at Rebecca for the first time. The resemblance to Margaret Henderson was unmistakable now that he was paying attention, and the silver pendant around Rebecca's neck was identical to the one found in the baby shoe. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're supposed to be dead," Rebecca finished. "That's what you told my birth mother and grandmother." But Joe Whitmore couldn't go through with it, could he? He saved my life by getting me to a family who would love me, even if they didn't know the truth. The confrontation was interrupted by a commotion outside. The German Shepherd had returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Following behind him was an elderly man with a white beard and gentle eyes, walking with the aid of a cane. Margaret gasped as she recognized the face that had aged 40 years since she last saw it. Joe Whitmore had finally come home to Millbrook, and he was carrying a briefcase that Sarah suspected contained the evidence that would finally bring justice to Rose Catherine's case. William Garrett's carefully constructed conspiracy was about to collapse around him, and from the look of panic in his eyes, he knew it. The question now was whether he would surrender quietly or attempt one last desperate act to protect himself. Outside, the German Shepherd sat calmly beside his master, having successfully completed the mission that had brought him to Millbrook. The truth was finally within reach, and Joe Whitmore had returned to make sure it could no longer be buried. Joe Whitmore entered the medical clinic with the careful movements of a man who had spent 40 years looking over his shoulder. His face bore the lines of decades spent in self-imposed exile, but his eyes held the clear resolution of someone who had finally decided to stop running from the past. "Hello, William," he said quietly, his voice carrying no anger despite everything that had passed between them. "I think it's time we told the truth." William Garrett's two companions moved closer, but Joe raised his hand peacefully. "There's no need for threats. I've spent 4 decades keeping your secret. But when I heard that Margaret Henderson was finally getting answers, I knew I had to come home." He set his briefcase on Dr. Lawson's desk and opened it with deliberate care. Inside were photographs, documents, and a leather journal that had obviously been well maintained despite its age. Sarah recognized it immediately as evidence that could destroy not just William Garrett, but the entire network that had operated in Millbrook for over 15 years. "I kept records of everything," Joe explained, addressing the room but looking directly at Rebecca. "Every child, every family, every payment. I told myself I was protecting innocent people by keeping quiet. But really, I was just protecting myself from William's threats." He handed Rebecca a photograph that made her gasp. It showed her as a 3-month-old baby, sleeping peacefully in a makeshift crib in what was clearly the basement of the abandoned house where they had found the baby clothes. She was wearing the same dress that had been preserved in the buried box, and around her tiny neck was the silver pendant that now matched the one she wore as an adult. I took care of you for 8 days, Joe said, his voice gentle with memory. "You were such a good baby, hardly ever cried. I kept hoping that William would change his mind, that he'd realize what we were doing was wrong. But then the orders came to finish the job, and I knew I couldn't do it." Margaret had been listening in stunned silence, but now she found her voice. "You saved her life. I arranged for the Walshes to adopt her through legitimate channels in Cincinnati," Joe confirmed. "It took me 3 days to drive there and back, and I spent every moment terrified that William would send someone after me. But I couldn't let an innocent baby pay for the adults' mistakes." Rebecca studied the photographs with tears in her eyes. Here was proof of the week that had changed the course of her entire life, documented by the man who had risked everything to save her. The images showed not just her physical presence, but the care Joe had taken to keep her safe and comfortable during their time together. William Garrett finally found his voice, but it was the desperate sound of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "Joe, you don't understand the pressure I was under. The town needed those development projects, and the families who adopted those children were grateful. Everyone benefited. Everyone except the mothers who grieved for babies who weren't actually gone, Sarah interjected sharply. Everyone except the grandmothers who spent 40 years wondering what really happened to their grandchildren. Joe opened his journal and began reading entries that chronicled not just Rose Catherine's case, but dozens of others spanning the 15 years of the conspiracy's operation. Each entry was meticulously detailed, including dates, names, payment amounts, and the justifications William had provided for each child's removal. March 15th, 1978, he read. William says the Morrison baby's mother is too young to raise a child properly. Arranged transfer to family in Cleveland. Payment, $15,000. June 3rd, 1979. Took Henderson infant as planned. William insists the single mother can't provide adequate environment. Struggling with conscience, but orders are clear. August 12th, 1980. Cannot go through with final phase. Child is innocent and deserves to live. Making arrangements for legitimate adoption. This will be my last involvement in William's operation. Dr. Lawson had been silently crying as Joe read, but now she spoke up. I have the medical records for all of them. Every fake death certificate, every forged document. I kept them as insurance. But they could restore these families if any of the other children are still searching for their origins. Rebecca looked around the room at the faces of people who had shaped her life in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Dr. Lawson, who had falsified her medical records to support the adoption. William Garrett, who had orchestrated her kidnapping for money and misguided social engineering. And Joe Whitmore, who had saved her life at the cost of his own freedom. Why did you come back now? She asked Joe. Because of him, Joe said, gesturing toward the window where the German Shepherd sat patiently in the afternoon sunshine. That's Rex. He's been my companion for the past 12 years, and he's been acting strange for weeks. Kept trying to lead me back toward Ohio, wouldn't settle down no matter where we went. I finally realized he was trying to tell me something. Sarah laughed despite the tension in the room. A dog led you back to Millbrook. Animals have instincts about these things that humans don't understand, Joe replied seriously. Rex knew it was time for the truth to come out, and when I heard on the news that someone had found baby clothes at my old house, I knew he was right. Outside, Rex seemed to sense that his mission was nearing completion. He stood up and walked to the clinic door, then sat down again with the patient air of a dog who knew that important business was being conducted inside. William Garrett made one last attempt to maintain control of the situation. Even if everything Joe says is true, the statute of limitations has expired on most of these cases. And who's going to believe the word of a man who's been hiding from the law for 40 years? But Sarah had been thinking like a journalist throughout the confrontation, and she knew that the legal implications were less important than the human ones. This isn't about prosecuting crimes from 40 years ago, Mr. Garrett. This is about giving families the chance to reunite with children they thought were lost forever. Rebecca stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Rex and thinking about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them all together. A dog's instinct, an old man's conscience, a grandmother's refusal to give up hope, and a journalist's dedication to uncovering truth had combined to solve a mystery that should have remained buried forever. I want to meet the other families, she said suddenly. If there are other children out there who were taken like I was, they deserve to know the truth about their origins, and their birth families deserve to know that their children are alive and well. Margaret reached for Rebecca's hand, still marveling at the miracle of having her granddaughter return to her after 4 decades of grief. We'll find them together, all of them. Dr. Lawson wiped away her tears and straightened her shoulders with new determination. I'll provide all the medical records I've kept hidden. It's time to make amends for what we did. Joe nodded his agreement. And I'll testify to whatever authorities want to hear the truth. I've spent 40 years running from this, but I'm too old to keep running." William Garrett's companions had gradually backed away from him as the evidence mounted, clearly unwilling to be associated with a conspiracy that was about to become public knowledge. The former principal found himself alone and defeated, his carefully maintained reputation about to become a cautionary tale about the abuse of authority and trust. As the afternoon sun began to set behind the hills surrounding Millbrook, the group emerged from the clinic to find that word of the confrontation had spread through the small town. A crowd had gathered on Main Street, drawn by curiosity and the human need to witness history being made. Rebecca walked directly to Rex and knelt down to scratch behind his ears. The German Shepherd looked up at her with intelligent eyes that seemed to convey satisfaction at a job well done. He had brought together all the people who needed to find each other, and his work was complete. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, knowing that he had somehow understood what needed to happen long before any of the humans involved. Margaret joined her granddaughter beside Rex, marveling at the strange chain of events that had restored her family. "40 years," she said softly. 40 years I wondered and worried and hoped. I never imagined the answer would come from a dog who knew where to dig. Sarah was already planning the series of articles that would tell this story to the world. But more importantly, she was thinking about the other families who might still be searching for answers. The Millbrook conspiracy had touched dozens of lives, and now there was finally hope for healing wounds that had festered for decades. As the crowd on Main Street grew larger, Joe Whitmore found himself surrounded by people he had known long ago, some offering forgiveness and others seeking explanations. But his attention was focused on Rebecca and Margaret, the two people whose lives he had tried to protect, even when he couldn't protect them completely. The train whistle sounded in the distance, the same melancholy call that had marked time in Millbrook for over a century, but today it seemed to carry a different message, not of departure and loss, but of arrival and reunion. Rex stood up and walked slowly toward the train tracks, his tail wagging gently as if he were saying goodbye. He had delivered his message and completed his mission. Now it was time for the humans to take over the work of healing and reconciliation. Margaret Henderson, Sarah Mitchell, Rebecca Walsh, and Joe Whitmore stood together as the train approached the station. 4 people bound together by a truth that had taken 40 years to surface. Behind them, the town of Millbrook was beginning to grapple with revelations that would change how they understood their own history. The German Shepherd disappeared into the evening shadows just as mysteriously as he had first appeared, leaving behind a legacy of truth that would echo through generations of families finally able to understand their own stories. Dear listeners, we hope that Margaret, Rebecca, and Sarah's incredible journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it has touched ours. This story of family, truth, and the mysterious ways that fate works to bring justice reminds us that some bonds can never truly be broken, no matter how much time passes or how deeply secrets are buried. If this tale of reunion and redemption has moved you, we have so many more stories waiting to be discovered together. Please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. It helps us reach other families who might be searching for their own missing pieces. Have you ever experienced a moment when an unexpected event changed everything? We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Every day, we bring you new tales that explore the beautiful complexity of human relationships and the extraordinary power of hope. Don't miss our upcoming stories about second chances, hidden truths, and the amazing ways that love finds a way to triumph over time and distance. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones that seem too amazing to be true, but turn out to be the most real of all.